I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it to the audience. So in July, if I'm not mistaken, there's a moment where TPA has to sort of be revisited. The TPA that was passed in May of 2015. Do we think, and I guess it's really a question for Steve, how do we think this is all going to play out when we get to April, when the president has to notice? If I understand the statute correctly, if he has to notice that he wants to renew TPA for 2 more years, and how do you think that might play out with all this going on?
Right. So yes. So for TPA to continue, the president has to affirmatively say that he wants to continue TPA to be in place, and it will then stay in place unless Congress affirmatively acts to deny TPA. So for TPA to stay in place, Congress basically has to do nothing. The president does have to do something. So, will the president ask for TPA to be extended? As John says, all things are possible, and it's been not always easy to predict what the administration will decide. But I think he will, just because just from the president, but also listening to the USTR, Lighthizer, Secretary Ross, they all seem to appreciate what TPA provides as far as trying to get something through Congress, get a trade agreement through Congress, or renegotiate NAFTA through Congress. And that would be much more difficult, if not impossible, to do so. In fact, if they're able to come up with a deal of a renegotiated NAFTA, they'd want that, because otherwise Congress, without TPA, would be able to amend the deal, and Congress would be able to take out things that Congress doesn't like in the renegotiated NAFTA. So, I would think that just from that point of view, they would definitely want to. They would want to do that. So, whether Congress would then affirmatively try to deny it, there may be calls to do so. I just doubt that it would, there'd be enough votes to do that. But I think, again, let's say, the president doesn't withdraw from NAFTA, and we get to a deal. When that deal is considered by Congress, and Congress also has an opportunity to say that TPA was not followed by the administration, either in consultation with Congress, not following the negotiating principles set out in TPA and other areas. So there could, Congress has that check on the president and on the USTR in that respect too. But I think if in their heart of hearts they really wanted to get out of NAFTA, they would have done it by now. And maybe we got close to that point last spring, but we didn't. We withdrew back. So I think it wouldn't make any sense to for the president not to ask for NAFTA for TPA to be extended.
So thank you for that discussion, everybody. We're going to take questions from the audience and others. I already start seeing some hands. We like to follow, my friend Scott Miller at CSI has coined this, the Jeopardy rules, where you must ask your question in the form of a question. And please identify yourself and your affiliation. We'll have a mic runner who will come around. Maybe we'll work from the back towards the front.
Hi, Bill Morley with the Altruist Group. Question, Stephen, you referenced some of the things Congress could do. So this has to do with sort of what Congress could do unilaterally without requiring a presidential signature. We talked about Congress potentially passing legislation to be subject to veto, stopping the president from withdrawal. You referenced some congressional action with respect to tariffs. What could Congress do unilaterally with respect to the tariff lines in NAFTA, and what form would that take? Would it be sort of a joint resolution or whatnot that would have legal effect?
Yeah, I mean, it would have to be legislation. And you'd run into the same situation where you need either president to sign it, or you have to get a veto-proof vote. It's an option. It's a pretty extreme option, I think. And for the policy reasons why I gave it, I think it doesn't make, it probably wouldn't make a lot of sense. So, I mean, I think it's something to consider, you know, that could be considered, but I think at the end of the day, you run into the same problems as trying to change the NAFTA Implementing Act. And, you know, frankly, if one wanted to go down that road, probably the better would be to change the Implementing Act rather than just trying to hardwire the tariff schedule.
If I could just add to that, I think and I agree with everything Steve said, you know, there is a possibility you could imagine where the president decides he wants to put the ball in the Congress's court, sort of in the way that the Iran deal was put in Congress's court. And Congress may or may not act pursuant to that. So again, it's more sort of senses of presidents and senses of Congresses, and it's more of political acts than statutory acts, but you could imagine such a scenario. And going in the other direction, you could imagine Congress asserting itself not through statute that would be subject to veto, but is a political gesture, to put it lightly, that would indicate its, if not substantive support of NAFTA, or at least support of not withdrawing from NAFTA. As Steve said, and others have said, updating NAFTA makes tremendous sense. But you could also imagine Congress wanting to assert its institutional role to indicate that it would look unfavorably on a unilateral act in light of the implementing legislation, regardless of the president's constitutional authority.
Hey, Mike Castellano from Disney. John, you said something that suggested that a year after withdrawal, tariffs would automatically revert. Could you explain that? Because I don't think I fully understood how you were describing that. And then also, I haven't heard anyone mention IEPA, and I was under the impression that that kind of was wide discretion to the president if an emergency, quote unquote, is declared. So I just wonder if any of you all can comment on that.
IEPA is very broad authority for the president to act in emergency situations. It's authority that I think statutorily is very broad, but because of that, frankly, as a policy matter, I think administrations have been cautious in exercising that authority. To use IEPA to change tariffs under NAFTA would strike me as drastic. With response to your initial question, my view is if the president withdraws from NAFTA, the tariffs would eventually default to U.S.-Canada with regard to U.S. and Canada, and default to WTO tariffs with regard to Mexico. Section 125 of the 74 Act allows the president to maintain NAFTA tariffs for a year, but he could also exercise to eliminate NAFTA level tariffs immediately.
Right. I mean, I just, because it sounds so interesting, I brought it with me. You know, it's Section 125E says, you know, duties required or appropriate to carry out any trade agreement entered pursuant to this act, which if you looked at the NAFTA implementing bill, it is, shall not be affected by any termination to withdraw and remain in effect for 1 year. Unless a president by proclamation provides a rates will be restored to the level they would be but for the agreement, which as John said, for Canada would be the U.S.-Canada agreement, and then for Mexico would be the WTO rates.
What's that language from? From NAFTA or the?
No, it's Trade Act 74, Section 125E.
Bill Lane, WITA. Let me, this is a question for Gary. I noticed recently, especially in today's paper, for example, the whole NAFTA debate's sort of getting into the phase of we can hurt you more than you can hurt us, and which is usually contrary to business. You know, we sort of grew up that the customer is always right. Right now, by far, the two biggest customers in the United States is Canada and Mexico. It's about a third of all exports. Assuming this sort of darker side keeps taking hold and we get into this, we can hurt you more than us. What other markets out there can you see where U.S. business can start reaching out to try to fill 1/3 of our exports, assuming a percent or a large percent of those have to be foregone for a while? Any markets come to mind that could fill such a void that's being filled right now with 150 million customers?
No, the answer is no, not in the short run, and I think for these purposes, the short run is between now and the 2018 election. Now, if you go over a 2 or 3 year period, we have a very resilient economy. But Canada and Mexico both have very smart trade officials and so forth. And what they will do if we come to this scenario is they will zero in on red states with districts which are exporting to them, or in some cases perhaps importing from Mexico and Canada vital inputs. Anyway, those will be the targets. So what we'll see is a lot of newspaper stories and TV stories and social media, so forth, about people who normally might have been Trump supporters, but they're out of a job, or their corn prices have gone down. Ag will be very much affected by this. So it would be a painful process within the United States. Now, I heard a number just yesterday, and I don't know who estimated it, that the U.S. could lose 900,000 jobs. Sorry, Mexico could lose 900,000 jobs. The U.S. could lose 250,000 jobs in some termination scenario. And we've run over this in our estimates, but it's not the aggregate number. It's that pinpoint story, the anecdote in a city, in a rural area, soybeans, and upper Mississippi area, that is going to be very painful. And for that reason, I'm kind of partial to a different zombie scenario than what Stephen was talking about. A scenario where the president says he's going to terminate sometime post 6 months from the date of the letter he issues. Not a specified date, post 6 months. And it's going to be negotiated between now and then, and he'll invite the Congress to say what they think should be done. But there's no actual termination. That's a different act. And he wouldn't do an actual termination, because once he does that, there are going to be congressional districts which he would like to win in 2018, which he will lose.
Lori Wallach from Public Citizen. I want to follow up on the zombie question. And this goes, Steve, to the 1974 Trade Act. That provision, the sub-E that your colleague also mentioned, it seems to give proclamation authority to the president to declare the tariffs back up to the MFN schedule quickly, with nothing but notice required. So the 1 year potential lurking higher tariffs, uneven tariffs wouldn't exist unless I'm misreading it. And same thing, zombie-wise, Article 109B of the implementing bill, the one that says the congressional approval is canceled with respect to any country that withdraws from the agreement. It doesn't have that language that kicks out the other statutes that were changed. But then Article 415 of the implementing act, actually, if a country's out, gets rid of all the AD/CVD changes statutorily. And so it looks like the only thing that actually gets changed by statute that isn't undone automatically is those food safety inspection rules. Close to my heart, but relatively speaking, not a huge thing. So I'm curious what part of it's, if it's Dracula in the coffin or the zombie or whatever it is, what part of it's still not totally gone.
No, I agree. As far as the section 125E, it's 1 year, and then they go back to whatever they would be but for the agreement, unless the president puts out a proclamation accelerating that. So, I mean, it's 1 year at most before the tariffs go back to what they would be without NAFTA. And as far as the other provisions in NAFTA, it's self-implementing bill. Yeah, you're right. I mean, that was maybe I didn't do it well enough. But I mean, that was the point I was trying to make, and is that there really isn't that much other than the tariffs, other than the government procurement that has the May, and then as you point out under the part implementing Chapter 19 also says that if there's an ongoing Chapter 19 dispute panel going on, and then NAFTA no longer applies, then the parties basically have a chance to then go to court, which is actually kind of interesting given that our Canadian friends yesterday started the Chapter 19 process on lumber. If the U.S. does withdraw from NAFTA, they're going to find themselves without a binational panel. They're going to have to go to the U.S. CIT and go in front of a judge instead of a couple, 5 panelists.
Bill Reich with Kelly Ryan Warren and the Stimson Center, depending on what day it is. This is a question for, mostly for John, although if Stephen wants to comment, that's great. I'm going to go back into 125 again, which really confuses me. It seems to me that it also authorizes the president to, I think the word is recommend to the Congress other duties, which raises the question of if he's going to recommend other duties, does Congress have anything to say about that? Do they have to approve them? Because there's nothing in the statute that says that, but the term recommendation implies that they have a role. Or can he, in fact, am I wrong that he can't recommend other duties? And related to that, if he in fact did recommend other duties, besides the default ones that you mentioned, wouldn't there be a WTO problem, an MFN problem?
Yeah, Bill, as I said before, my reading of 125 and in conjunction with NAFTA implementing is if the president does withdraw, not just gives the notice, but actually does withdraw, and for simplicity, let's say then a year lapses after that withdrawal. So this window under 125 for the president to accelerate the change of NAFTA tariffs to U.S.-Canada tariffs or WTO tariffs. He has 1 year where he could exercise his authority to accelerate the expiration of NAFTA tariffs. But that's it. I mean, he can recommend tariffs. Any president, any day of the week, can make all sorts of recommendations to the Congress, but I don't see how that changes law, unless Congress acts on that recommendation and sends the president back a statute implementing that. So I don't think there's 125 is getting a lot of attention, but I think it's a fairly narrow authority of the president, and that's only to more quickly move to WTO/US-Canada tariff rates. That's the extent of his legal authority.
No, yeah, I agree with John. I mean, I think, again, just reading the plain language of the provision, it seems to sound like, the president can recommend, it says, okay, Mr. President, Madam President, you can say to Congress what you think the duties should be. I guess presumably, if not, the duties that they would default to after the year or after the proclamation, if you were to accelerate it. You can make that recommendation to Congress, but it just stops there. So, presumably Congress would have to take up that recommendation and enact it through legislation for it to actually become law. And then I mean, the WTO issue you bring up is the interesting one. And I think facially, yeah, it could, you know, it could be a violation.
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. Being a non-lawyer, I'm going to be very hesitant to a legal question, but I was reading somewhere, and maybe it was in the NAFTA implementing bill, that said that the president had the right, or the president could only increase duties if necessary to assure reciprocity in terms of treatment. And if Mexico, and I thought that meant that if Mexico suddenly showed up and said, by the way, we're not going to increase our duties, we're going to keep them at zero, the president would have a hell of a time convincing people that this was not a fair situation for the U.S. I don't know where that provision appeared, but let me make the question now, is that if it doesn't exist, and it may not, is it more likely that if the president does decide after a year, or announces he's pulling out of NAFTA, isn't it more likely that Congress may then turn around and pass legislation that simply says, we do not want you to increase the rates of duties, you know, that will happen automatically because too many of our constituents are going to be harmed by Mexico retaliating and increasing its own rate of duty. So that kind of very limited legislation, I think, is possible, and I call it the Iranian example. Somebody, you guys used that before I did. The Iranian example of how you do it. The president has not done anything. He talks a lot, but other than TPP, he has done really nothing that has harmed anything yet. Thank you.
Let me give a non 100% full-time lawyer answer to that. It's 209B that you're talking about, and you're right, it has the word reciprocity. My view is that the president ran on the proposition that we are not getting fair treatment. Now, I disagree with that, but he said that many times, including just last week, or maybe earlier this week in Da Nang, that the U.S. is being taken advantage of. You know, that's lack of reciprocity. So my view is that 209B, he can raise the tariffs to whatever he thinks is necessary to ensure that we get fair treatment from our NAFTA partners. And he's not limited by MFN. Of course, he does run into WTO problems if he goes beyond MFN, but I think it's a very broad provision. Now, John may tell me that no, it is a very narrow provision.
Gary, let's make a deal. You stick to economics, and I'll stick to law. Gary's a friend. Look, my opinion is that that authority is dependent upon implementing legislation, implementing the agreement. And if we're in a phase now of moving away from the agreement, and certainly the agreement isn't in place, those authorities don't exist. So the president's authorities are contingent upon furthering NAFTA, those authorities don't live in a vacuum.
John's right.
Can I just add that, just for people who don't necessarily know this, the MFN, the WTO tariffs we're talking about, they're not reciprocity based. So the U.S. bound and applied rates are very much, well, significantly lower than the Mexican bound and applied rates. So just keep that in mind when we say back to MFN rates. That does not mean that we get what the Trump administration necessarily would want, but were they to go sort of, you know, one-to-one on the reciprocity issue, they would have a WTO problem. So.